Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Monday, April 13th, 2026. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. And it has been 2 weeks now since Governor Bob Ferguson signed the income tax bill into law. We have a legal challenge filed last Friday by Citizen Action Defense Fund, along with former Attorney General Rob McKenna, former State Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmage, and several other plaintiffs that have joined the challenge, which was filed in Klickitat County Superior Court. Now, among those plaintiffs is the National Federation of Independent Business, NFIB, very worried that their small business members here in Washington state are going to be impacted by the income tax, which again, remind you that it's a 10% or 9.9% tax on income above $1 million. But when you're a small business, you most likely operate in our state, at least, as a pass through entity. So, business income that comes in looks like personal income for you. So, you likely aren't bringing home anywhere near $1 million as a small business owner, as far as your personal income goes, but it looks like that's income. And thus, you're going to be taxed under this new law like you're a wealthy guy. You're able to pay your fair share, as supporters of the income tax say. So I had a chance to chat with NFIB about that today, their major concerns for their members and why they took the move to get involved in this lawsuit. So that was a fascinating conversation. I hope you'll stay tuned for that. And then why did Governor Bob Ferguson veto $500,000 in the operating budget for combating organized retail theft? We are the worst in the state of Washington as far as retail theft numbers go, and the lack of prosecution is a big piece of that. There is one Democrat lawmaker who worked really hard to secure funding in this year's budget, the supplemental operating budget, and it was right up until the very end when she found out that the governor planned to veto that. So we have some reaction from the governor when he was pushed by another reporter after signing the operating budget a couple of weeks ago. Why in the world he vetoed this $500,000? Really kind of a drop in the bucket, if you will, as far as the overall budget, numbers go. When in fact, if you really help out our retailers who are struggling, whether it's to put bars on the windows or hire a security guard to stand outside to stop these guys, there's so much to be gained. So we're going to get into that a little bit in today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. All right, so a lawsuit was filed last Thursday, April the 9th, in Klickitat County Superior Court, challenging the new income tax or the millionaire's tax, whichever side you kind of come down on that. The lead attorneys are former State Attorney General Rob McKenna, a former Democratic state lawmaker and Supreme Court Justice by the name of Phil Talmage, who you'll hear from in just a moment here, and then Jackson Maynard at Citizen Action Defense Fund. Now, supporters of this tax, which again is 9.9% on income above $1 million or combined household income above that $1 million threshold, again at that 9.9% level. So the hope is for supporters of this tax that when it eventually gets to the state Supreme Court, where everybody kind of concedes it's going to end up, that you've got maybe a court that says, hey, this is, precedent from initially the 1930s, even though they've revisited it several times. And voters have weighed in through citizen initiatives several times rejecting the income tax. The hope for supporters is that now you're going to have a court that says times have changed, budgets have changed, the needs for, additional revenue for the state justify the need for this tax. And we've got enough millionaires here in Washington. No harm, no foul to them. Let's keep this in place. That's their hope. Opponents, though, including those in the legal challenge that we're talking about here, they believe the court and hope the court will not ignore precedents, which have been clear in ruling that my income is my property. Your income is your property per the Washington state constitution. And property taxes by our state constitution must be uniform and limited. And so the folks behind this lawsuit believe the new income tax disregards all of that plain language in the Constitution and decades of consistent Supreme Court precedent. So, former state lawmaker and Supreme Court Justice, a Democrat, Phil Talmage, has joined the lawsuit. He told the Center Square that majority Democrats, in his opinion, have gotten far too accustomed to budgeting outside their means and setting up an insatiable appetite for revenue.
As a legislator, I was confronted often with the question, we need additional revenue. Where are we going to go to get it? I mean, I was on the Ways and Means Committee in the state Senate for 14 of my 16 years there. We had to deal with those revenue related issues. Where do we go to get money that we need? Well, first of all, you also have an obligation to be careful about expenditures to make sure that what you're spending money on is actually, appropriate. It's a focused need that the people of the state of Washington have. And not just simply, we just want more revenue for the sake of more revenue, but we really have to have a pressing need to accomplish certain goals that we want to do. My mentor as a legislator was Bud Shinpo, who always said, I want to make sure that what we provide to people is $1 worth of services for $1 worth of revenue. So if we're going to tax people, we give them really good services worth what we tax them for.
So earlier today, I had the chance to interview Elizabeth Melito. She is the executive director of the National Federation of Independent Business and their Small Business Legal Center. NFIB is a party to this lawsuit filed last Thursday in Klickitat County Court challenging the new income tax law. NFIB worked hard during session. I remember sitting in some of the public hearings on the income tax and seeing their Washington State Representative Patrick Connor, who was basically telling lawmakers, you don't know what you're doing here with a tax on just millionaires. He was trying to get them to understand, NFIB was trying to get majority Democrats to understand that business earnings are not the same as take home pay. And with 85% of small businesses in our state organized as pass-through entities for federal tax purposes, many of them will end up being subjected to the income tax. So they're not millionaires. They don't live in high dollar mansions. They don't have yachts. They're not living a life of luxury. It's just the way their business is organized as an S Corp or L Corp, that it makes sense to organize that way. And yet that's going to subject them to this income tax. So here is Beth Melito with NFIB breaking down this pass-through entity impact for the income tax in a pretty clear way that even I can understand. So here she is.
When you have a C corp set up a separate corporate entity, there's a lot that goes along with that as far as record keeping, things you need to do. So it can mean more bookkeeping, more accounting costs, and that's less money than that you're able to put into the business there. So for simplicity's sakes, and it's perfectly acceptable, and in fact, a large majority of NFIB members are pass-through, and the plaintiffs in this case too are pass-through entities. And that again means that their business income is reported on their personal tax return. It does not mean that they are keeping that in the bank and banking it and going around and spending it on, personal things. What that means is they are keeping it and then reinvesting it in the business. So they're, you know what I mean? They're it's coming through, but they're putting it right back into the business more times than not. So they're using that and reinvesting that income into the business.
Now, the Washington Department of Revenue is gearing up to help businesses facing hardships because of the coming income tax. Remember, it doesn't come due until 2029, and that'll be based on 2028 earnings. So just like right now, we're all paying our, oh my gosh, it's coming up on 2 days is the tax deadline. We're all doing our income taxes now if we haven't already, as far as federal income taxes go. But this would be the first year, 2028 earnings would be the first year for the state income tax. So businesses through Department of Revenue can apply for some payment plans. DOR has set up, I guess, more than 50 incentive programs, including some credits for specific kind of business activities that you might be involved in. So they're doing their best, I guess, at this point to, help small businesses protect themselves in advance of this new income tax going into effect. But Melito, again, with NFIB, who you just heard from, she says their members are fully convinced that this is not going to remain a tax just at the $1 million threshold, that it's eventually going to be a tax on all income earners in the state of Washington. And they're very concerned, based on surveys of their members in the state of Washington, that people are thinking about leaving. We've talked about this. We've got the, small business groups here in the state of Washington that have also been surveying their members and saying, we may get the heck out of Dodge before this thing is implemented. So we've got time to relocate, potentially relocate, employees. Some people just maybe can re-domicile out of the state, but still have business operations here. So we'll see how all that plays out. But she's very concerned. And based on what they've heard from their members, she thinks there will be a lot of flight to avoid this tax.
And one thing that we have heard from our members, even those that don't necessarily report $1 million on their tax returns, but we have many members that are, under that threshold, but they are still very concerned that this is, the camel's nose under the tent. I always mix up my metaphor, so I'm probably, but you know what I mean. So this is just, the first step towards an income tax on potentially all Washingtonians at some point too, that the threshold will just be lowered. We're going to start with $1 million. Oh, this has been approved. The courts approved this. And we certainly hope that ultimately we do win. But if, by chance we don't prevail, then you better believe that I think the legislature is going to come back, right? Because it's going to go down to 500,000 and then it's going to, you know what I mean? So I do really fear that this is the first step towards an income tax. If we don't defeat this in court, step towards an income tax on all Washingtonians.
Now, reminder that this lawsuit is not the only challenge to the new income tax. We have Let's Go Washington and founder Brian Haywood trying to get a referendum drive going. Secretary of State Steve Hobbs has stopped them. He says the legislation, since Senate Bill 6346, which established the income tax, contains a necessity clause that made the bill referendum proof. And Haywood argues that Hobbs is altering an interpretation of the state constitution to say that, you can have this be a referendum proof bill. And on April 30th, so what is that? We're like just 2 weeks away. The state Supreme Court has agreed to hear arguments on this case. So that is significant. And they understand there's some urgency here because there would just be a matter of weeks for Let's Go Washington to gather about 200,000 signatures to get a referendum approved for the ballot if the state Supreme Court gives them the go-ahead. We can also likely expect a couple of citizen initiatives or an initiative maybe to the legislature and separately one that goes directly to the voters as soon as this November. So a lot of fronts there with folks interested in trying to get rid of this new income tax before it takes effect. Okay, now to organized retail theft. It's why here in Washington, you can't go to the grocery store and buy deodorant or a razor or cold medicine or baby formula or a bottle of wine without having a locked cabinet to get through to get that item in your hands. Or in some cases, some stores just say, okay, we'll grab that for you. We'll meet you up at the check stand and you can pick it up there because we don't trust you to carry it out of the store. And that's because we have the highest rate of retail theft in the state of Washington. So now we had a pilot program that just went into effect this last year. I'm pretty sure it was $1 million. Don't quote me on that, but it was roughly $1 million that went out to counties and cities to help law enforcement work more with organizations combating this organized retail theft. It's not just a guy who's hungry for a sandwich going to steal something from the deli. Oftentimes, these are folks that have gone in with a list sent in by very organized retail criminals, this is what you're going to take. This is how you're going to do it. This is what you're going to get in exchange. Many of these people are in drug addiction and are doing this to feed their own addiction. In exchange, we've got organized retail criminals making a lot of money, stealing a lot of money from our retailers, and ultimately it leads to increased costs in the stores. And it leads to a whole bunch of frustration. So Governor Ferguson vetoed $500,000 in this year's supplemental operating budget. He did it at the last minute. It was to kind of continue this pilot program, which has been finding some success. There have been far more prosecutions of folks that have been caught up in this, or caught in this, I should say. Maybe it's 2, 3, 5, how many times you have to get caught shoplifting, if you will, before they actually prosecute you. But there have been far more prosecutions in the last year because of this pilot program. So they're seeing success, and retailers are saying, give us some more. Help us out a little bit more so we can keep our doors open. But instead, that veto came from Governor Ferguson at the very last minute. And he was asked about that by reporters just after signing the supplemental operating budget.
As Attorney General, I literally created a unit that prosecutes organized retail theft. Created a group of people who get together, law enforcement, retailers, businesses, to talk about how we can improve that. So there are literally far more resources today to combat and actually bring cases of organized retail theft because now work in the AG's office than we ever had before. So no, I take it very seriously. At the same time, look, we've got a budget we have to balance. And there were cuts in this budget. Our state agencies took $1 billion in cuts. That's going to impact individuals and the work we do. So, I looked at anything that came through the budget pretty carefully.
Now, businesses in Washington state are losing more than $2.5 to $3 billion a year because of organized retail theft. And that in exchange means the state is missing out on, they estimate, $600 million in state and local tax collections every single year. State Representative Mari Levitt, a Democrat from University Place, she criticized the decision. She's worked a lot on legislation in recent years, and I spent a great deal of time invested in this. She was very displeased when the governor issued that last minute veto of, again, what amounted to only $500,000, $500,000 to help out address this problem. Now, in a statement, she wrote that the King County Prosecutor's Office, January through June of last year, so just the first 6 months of 2025, they filed 142 retail theft cases. Probably just a drop in the bucket for those actually out committing those crimes, but it was 2.5 times more than the average across the previous 4 years. And she says in large part it was because of this money put into that pilot program that sort of helped law enforcement work with retail groups, work with businesses to say, this is the bad guy. This is the guy who's been in here time after time. Here's his handler. Let's go after these guys. And it's been working. So she wrote, she issued a statement after finding out about the governor's veto, writing that counties, including King, Snohomish, and Spokane, have used the funding from that pilot program to tackle this program. Here's part of what she said. I want to put that up on the screen for you to see. She said, basically, without these funds, we are unable to build on those successes, and the progress we have made has been put at risk. It leaves our small businesses at risk and does nothing to help customers and workers in our communities feel safe. It is short-sighted and harmful to our neighborhoods. This veto will end up costing us far more than what was requested in this allocation. I also today got some comments back from the National Retail Federation, very upset about this. They sent me some of their stats, and I wanted to share this with you because I found it to be a little bit alarming. I guess I didn't realize how dangerous some of these organized retail crime operators really are and how big of a deal it is. But their 2025 report, again, this is from the National Retail Federation, so not just specific to Washington. They say there's been a troubling shift in recent years in what they call ORC operations. That's the organized retail crime. So ORC operations moving beyond physical store theft to more sophisticated forms. They told me 67% of retailers report the involvement of a transnational orc group in thefts against their company just in the past year. Now, I did reach back out to the office of Governor Bob Ferguson today asking for further explanation as to why he issued that last minute veto, because as you saw in his explanation, he really just said, well, I did a lot while I was AG. We created these things and we've got these networks of folks working together now better than ever. And yet there's just not the money now because we had to make some difficult budgetary decisions. But he did not get into his logic as to why it made sense to do this veto when it sounds like, based on what I'm hearing from others, there's a lot more tax revenue at risk every year because we allow this to continue. So you had a $500,000 veto that maybe could have, produced a lot better results, including tax revenue for the state, let alone what it costs all of us when we go to the store. You're not just paying more for that loaf of bread because it costs more for the gas to get it there and, inflation, but it's more because the store has to hire the security guard to be outside, and the additional cameras and the bar turns that you have to go through to go in. All those things cost money, and it translates to a higher bill at the store for us. So if I get anything back further from the governor, I did not in time for this podcast today, but if I do, I will certainly share that with you. I look forward to continuing to follow this story and look forward to a conversation as well with Representative Mari Levitt later this week. So we'll share that in an episode of Washington in Focus Daily later this week. So thank you for watching. Always appreciate and welcome you to check out our website at thecentersquare.com/Washington. Have a great rest of your day.